Anti-coup demonstrators continue to defy the brutal crackdown by the military. Major trade unions have called on members to shut down the economy from today to choke and paralyze the military government. Meanwhile, in a shocking development, an official from Suu Kyi's party was beaten to death in an overnight raid in Yangon, and several others were detained. Witnesses have reported sounds of gunfire or stun grenades in many districts of the commercial capital after nightfall. The show of force comes after an alliance of 9 unions planned a full extended shutdown of the economy. The call for a general strike as part of a massive civil disobedience movement is meant to block all benefits to the military, which comes when economic and business activities continue as usual. An official from Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy party died in police custody overnight after being detained and reportedly physically abused by the forces. 58-year-old Khin Maunglat was a local NLD chairman in Yangon, Myanmar's biggest city. According to his deputy chairman, pictures from the military hospital where he died showed that he had a wound on the back of his head and bruises on his back. Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy party has confirmed that some party officials were arrested in overnight raids by security forces. However, party official So Win added that the exact number of people arrested cannot be ascertained as of now. NLD MP Sithu Maung posted on Facebook that security last night were searching for the party's information officer Yu Maung Maung at his house but couldn't find him. He says that Yu Maung Maung's brother was beaten by police and his body was held in an upside-down position while he was brutally tortured by the authorities. Meanwhile, United Nations says that at least 50 people, more than 50 people, have died since the Myanmar military staged a coup on the 1st of February. More than 50 people have died as the military authorities continue their violent crackdown on the anti-coup demonstrators across Myanmar. We are now joined by Eamon Thant, a journalist who is joining us from Yangon, which is Myanmar's biggest city, for more details and to get a sense of what exactly is the situation on the ground in Yangon. Now, Eamon Thant, we are getting this disturbing news that a member of Suu Kyi's party has died in police custody overnight and that that person was beaten by the authorities. What more can you tell us?
So what we know from the military report of his death is that his body does show signs that he was brutalized before he died. The military are denying any sort of responsibility and say that he died of a heart issue. We are also seeing that the military is now ramping up its attempts to quell dissent as well as incite fear in the public. And so with the people who were arrested in night raids, it wasn't just that they were after people who, are wanted based on their list of who they are hoping to arrest, but also taking their family members in their stead if they are not able to be found.
Right, but reports suggest that the person who died in police custody had an injury at the back of his head. What are exactly the members of Suu Kyi's party saying on this?
They're saying that he was tortured before his death, and it's quite likely that based on the bruising and the sort of injuries that we've seen, that he was beaten by batons. And because he's an older gentleman and he does have heart issues and things like that, it's quite likely he was beaten to death.
Right. We're also getting pictures. We are getting visuals from across Myanmar. We saw some visuals suggested that the military authorities were rounding up students and doctors and making them sit on the roads, and they were being beaten as well. United Nations says more than 50 people have died already as the military authorities continue their crackdown on the anti-coup protesters. Meanwhile, there have been calls for a strike today in Myanmar. What is the purpose behind it? How successful would it be?
So the main anti-military movement here in Myanmar is called the Civil Disobedience Movement, and it's essentially a movement in which people are trying to ensure that the military does not get any funding and also is unable to govern the country. So part of the sort of movement against funding is the strikes calling for international sanctions, boycotts by people here from buying things owned by military conglomerates or anything owned by a general or his family. And then the sort of destruction of state infrastructure is the other big part of it. And that's why people have been seeing doctors, students, nurses, teachers being targeted. People in public institutions, which the majority of hospitals, schools, things like that in Myanmar are government run, are essentially striking from work, choosing not to either go to work or obey government orders. And the general strike is essentially an attempt to stop everything that's happening in the country, to both show the military that, you know, there's no voter fraud here, that the people did vote for the NLD despite what the military is claiming in terms of the voter fraud that they are justifying their coup with, but also to ensure that the military is essentially unable to enact any of their policies.
Right. One final question to you. The world is seeing what's happening in Myanmar. We're getting visuals from across the country. But tell us exactly, what's the situation on the ground in Yangon? What's the sense among the people? We know the military authorities are using violent means to crack down on the protesters. More than 50 has died. So has that deterred the protesters at all, or are you seeing more and more people join these protests as the days go by?
So I think we're seeing a diminishing number of people who are on the streets as the days have grown more violent. What you've seen, you know, in the first few days of the protest movement was everyone was on the streets, you know, young and old, people from all different walks of life. Now what you're seeing more is the youth. So, you know, like people in their late teens into early 30s really out on the streets protesting, while other sectors of society are providing support, such as cooking meals for them, allowing them to run into their homes when the police fire tear gas, things like that, rather than being out on the streets. But you are, I think, definitely seeing a growing movement in terms of the number of people supporting the civil disobedience movement. There's been over 600 police officers who have defected from military rule and have essentially left their jobs or refused to follow orders while at their jobs, as well as some soldiers. And even yesterday, when it was very scary here in Yangon, starting around, I think, 10 p.m., people heard rapid gunfire, as well as explosions going off from townships across the city. But at the same time, you know, once an explosion happened, you also heard people yelling Happy New Year and sort of making fun of what the military was doing. And so I think there's also a sense of defiance and happiness that people are trying to maintain despite all of this.
You know, credit to the people of Myanmar. You know, people of Myanmar have long endured military rule, isn't it? Myanmar, for more than 5 decades, was under military rule. Are you seeing the latest round of protests? Are these at the same scale like the ones we saw in early 2000s, and or are these larger in scale than the ones that we have seen previously in Myanmar?
So I think if we're comparing it to the previous two mass uprisings, which was in 1988 and 2007, these are definitely bigger than those in terms of the number of people out, as well as the diversity of people who are out. I think right now what you're really seeing is a Myanmar in which people from different ethnic and religious backgrounds are really coming together for a common cause. And that's a bit different from 2007, when it was really Buddhist religious leaders who were leading the movement. And then in 1988, which was a very student-led movement, that was still sort of not quite as inclusive of the different ethnic and religious groups who are in Myanmar.
Amen Thant, journalist from Yangon, thank you so much for joining us on WION and giving us a real sense of what the situation is on the ground.
Thank you for having me.